All right, well, aloha. We're here with Associate Professor Alex Golub here at the University of Hawaii Manoa. Thank you very much for having us here. And first of all, maybe can you tell us how you came into anthropology as a discipline? What brought you to become an anthropologist?
Right. I mean, it's chance. Like most things in life, it's just one thing after another happened, and pretty much I ended up with a career. But when you look back on it and sort of make sense of it all, I think really my experience in high school is what got me interested in anthropology. So that's sort of from 18 to 14 in the States. And I'm from a wealthy upper middle class family, and I was bused into an inner city high school to attend a performing arts program. I wanted to be an actor. I went from my relatively homogenous, affluent white suburban community to this high school that was just absolutely roiling with issues of race, class, just dealing with all of the social strains that were going on in California in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was quite a lot of them back then. And I think I sort of came out of that thinking, wait a second, what is going on? What is going on with race in this country? Why does the rest of the country think race is about white and black people when in California it's about, white people, Mexican people, and Asians? Why didn't the janitors go on strike with the teachers? Those were the questions that really got me interested in thinking about human societies, I guess. So by the time I got to college, I was looking for a major that would help me make sense of what I had seen. Anthropology happened to be the major that worked best for me.
And was there still this element of acting? Because anthropologists, at least as teachers, still have a degree of acting. Do you get to act and perform for your students? Is that still an element, or have you left the acting dreams behind?
I don't think, actually I think that acting and real life, what is the difference between them? That's a much more complicated question than you might at first think. I think for me, one of the powers of acting when I was in high school was the way that we were addressing issues of race and class and gender to a certain extent, sexuality, through art. And realizing that art, and particularly the performing arts, was a way to work through these issues. That's not something everybody has an opportunity to do. A lot of times when people think about race and class, they think, oh, you read novels about this to help you be aware of what's going on. They don't think about getting up on stage and enacting these incredibly emotionally powerful scenarios. So that was part of it. And I think acting also provided me a certain kind of knowledge that there's a kind of knowledge that isn't just cerebral, it isn't just purely intellectual, it's embodied. It takes practice, it's artisanal, it takes mentorship, and I think that stuck with me, and it shaped my willingness to engage in anthropology, because so much of the fieldwork experience is about embodied experience, living there, being there, smelling it, doing it. I think the acting and the performing arts helped keep me knowledgeable that there was more than one way to know, and that knowing was a full body experience. And I think if I had done quantitative sociology, I wouldn't have been able to hold on to those insights.
And for your graduate work, you went to Papua New Guinea. Can you tell us how did that come about?
Oh, this is the moment where chance really comes in. I did my undergraduate thesis in the historical anthropology of Papua New Guinea. So I studied what happened in Papua New Guinea in the 1920s and 1930s. It was good for a thesis because it was historical. You just got the explorers' reports and you read them. There were some books being written at the time on that topic. But I didn't want to do research in Papua New Guinea. I thought, this is historical. How can I study the 1930s? So instead I thought, I want to go to Indonesia and I want to study Bali, right? That seems different. I want to do that. But when I got to the University of Chicago, where I did my PhD, the person who was the Southeast Asianist there, the Indonesianist, it turned out was ill and was going to pass away. He had a brain tumor, unfortunately. But the man who ended up being my dissertation supervisor had read my undergraduate thesis and thought I was going to study Papua New Guinea. And he was a Pacificist. So he sort of pulled me aside and said, so you're going to write on Papua New Guinea? And I said, yes, of course I'm going to write on Papua New Guinea. And he said, what are you going to write on since you can't write on the 1930s anymore? And I literally just gone on the internet, which was quite new at the time, and Googled around. And it looked like, it was pre-Google, I Yahooed around. And one of the things that was going on there was mining. In the area that I had studied for my undergraduate thesis in the 30s, the going concern in the 90s and aughts was mining. So I ended up studying that, and that's how it happened.
And you just published a book on your work in Papua New Guinea around mining. And one of the key issues that you talk about is around indigenous people and how the term indigenous people gets asserted by the people living there, but also by the government elites in Port Moresby and by other policy wonks all around the region, really, and by the mining executives. Can you tell us a bit more about what indigeneity means to you, or how you would define it, I guess?
Well, in the case of Porgera, you have a situation where there's a group of people living in a place. They're citizens of Papua New Guinea. And the third largest gold mine, basically, it's complicated how you measure gold mines, opened up. At first, the relationship between the local community and the gold mine was fraught, but relatively successful. It's increasingly gone off the rails since then. There's tremendous social problems in the valley. So the question is, when you reach outside the valley to speak to different audiences and say, we need help, who are you and how do you frame it? People in Papua New Guinea oftentimes frame themselves as citizens of the state. And they ask the government, why are you protecting the mine's interests instead of ours? Aren't we your citizens, right? But when it comes to an international arena, people realize that the audience is expecting to hear about indigeneity, right? Because indigeneity in general means a group of people who existed prior to the arrival of colonialism and colonial governments, and it continue to exist today and increasingly are thriving today. Right, so it's really a definition of a community surviving and resisting, responding to colonialism. In the case of Papua New Guinea, there wasn't a lot of settler colonialism, and the nation is pluralistic. There's no one majority group. So they don't really look indigenous to us. And when I was living in Papua New Guinea, people didn't describe themselves as indigenous to me. But when they began accessing the UN or global activist networks, suddenly indigeneity was the language that they wanted to speak. And that's the language they've been speaking with increasingly.
And that's how they self-define?
No, actually, I very rarely hear the term indigenous used in Porgera. And I think Porgerans themselves don't tend to think of themselves that way necessarily. But they think of themselves as people who are willing to grow and change. And if indigeneity fits, then I think that's something that they're willing to take on. It's a very different situation from the situation here at UH Manoa, where there are Hawaiian people who have been here for centuries before the arrival of Haoles or white people, and who are now attempting to reassert their political and cultural identity. There aren't colonizers in Papua New Guinea.
And one of the interesting things, reading one of your papers, was that you were writing that the Ipili people, who live in the area where the Porgera mine is situated, were using what you call predatory expansion. And the thing that I'd written down was that the way Ipili people see the law, and especially Western law, and in a way start to define Westerners, and you're taken away from that in a way, that relationship between the people we work with and the ideas that they have speak not just back at us, but also in a way define us to some degree. Is that a reading that's...
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I should have come up with that myself, and the article would have been shorter. Yeah, no, I think that's right. One of the important things to understand about indigeneity is that colonialism is a prerequisite for it. People don't come to see themselves as indigenous and united with other indigenous communities around the world without the presence of settler colonialism or colonialism more broadly. But at the same time, the settlers who are currently occupying the nation states where indigenous people live, they see themselves as being connected to, or their identities are defined by those indigenous groups, right? So it's really wrong to think of there being two cultures, Australian in the sense of white Australian and Aboriginal. Really, it makes more sense to see a singular cultural field within which both the Australian government and Australian nation state, which is largely white, is defining itself in relationship to Aboriginal culture, right? It's a similar thing in the United States. Half of the vehicles that our military use are named after Indians, right? And yet at the same time, the code name for Osama bin Laden was Geronimo, right? The name of a famous American Indian leader. So a lot of times, forging new identities free of the European metropole, free of the European countries that white people came from, involves adapting or taking, some would say stealing, co-opting, appropriating bits of indigenous culture. So it's wrong to see the colonial situation as one of two distinct cultures. It makes more sense to see it in terms of a single cultural field with different groups that are porous and interacting, unite around that, yeah.
And those are often quite contentious issues, dealing with indigeneity, dealing with racism. You're also the co-founder of the most popular anthropology blog called Savage Minds, and we'll have a link to that in the course.
All right, yeah.
Great segue. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got started with a blog that has become quite famous within discipline and beyond, and how you think the internet has changed the way anthropology functions, or certainly the way you do anthropology works?
Well, I got interested in doing Savage Minds when I got back from Papua New Guinea, because I managed to leave the United States and spend 2 years in the highlands of Papua New Guinea at the height of the internet bubble. So I left the country and I was using Yahoo. And I came back to find everybody using something called Google. And everybody knew that the world was changing because of the internet, but when you had been taken out of it and put in a place where shortwave radio was the main way to communicate during my first trip, and came back, it was just obvious that something incredibly important had happened. And at the same time, I think doing my field work and reading a lot of social science, I began thinking, you know, what about all those other genres that I loved? What about plays? What about novels? What about journalism? What are some other ways of writing and thinking and knowing? What am I giving up to spend the rest of my life writing just academic papers? So I started the blog with a couple of other people, because at the time there wasn't an anthropology blog around that would cover the field as a whole. And the internet has changed everything in every way, but not everything in every way. And anthropology has been changed tremendously by it, although it's also the same in many ways. But I think for me, the most important part of Savage Minds as a blog is very similar to the most important thing that your course is going to do, which is that it makes the discipline available to people who are not in the ivory tower. The world is filled with millions and millions, billions of people who are just entering the educated middle class in China, in India, in Africa, increasingly in Latin America. And these people want to know what's going on in the world. They want to know what science has figured out. They want to know what people in the first world are thinking. And so much of that knowledge that they long for, that they want to be part of, is denied to them because it's behind a paywall. Or you have to go to a university to meet a professor, which, if you think about it, is a little ridiculous. There are two groups that are giving it away for free, right? That is terrorists and Christian missionaries. So if you want to learn about the Christians' war on the West, there are many extremist groups that will tell you that. If you want to learn about the Muslim war on freedom, then you can also learn that for free. But the middle ground, what most people think, and most importantly, the results of science, not opinion, but science, those are not available. So in many ways, the blog is designed to let people see what it's like to really do anthropology, to get some sense of what we are doing and what we are thinking, not watering it down, but just letting you see what we're doing, make that transparent, right? And let's try to give that away and make it available, rather than have the only option for the growing middle class be something that I think of as more culturally extreme.
And I think the next step is also something I read about on your website, that you're an open access activist, which ties in with that you want your scientific knowledge to be as widely accessible as possible. So how do you work in order to get your articles published in open access journals, or work towards more open access journals in the discipline? What's the next step for anthropology?
Well, open access is the scholarly ideal that information should be available to everyone. And it's not a new ideal. It's at the heart of the Enlightenment. It's at the heart of the project that spawned the university systems as they currently exist. And we've done a great job so far of creating journals where people can go and read this sort of thing. And we need more of them. We need to find ways to get those journals sustainable, in other words, to pay for them. And there are many, many experiments going on right now to do that, and there are many, many great successes for doing that. One of the things that I personally am interested in is finding a way to develop aids to make open access resources discoverable. This is similar to the job of the blog, which is to sort of cover the anthropology beat for the internet. There's so much material now that's open access, but so much of it is difficult to find. It's difficult to locate. You have to already be an expert to know that the journal is open access. So I'm interested increasingly these days on trying to build a layer of material on top of the rapidly developing corpus of open access material, and to try to develop edited papers, anthologies, occasional paper series, bibliographies, to help people locate the information that's already open access. Because there's so much of it available, but it needs to be put in context and it needs to be pointed to. And that's increasingly what I'm trying to do today.
So in a way, create a gatekeeper that's a guide to the wealth of information that's out there. Whereas previously the gatekeeping is done by search engines within the paywall systems of the major publishers, but create an open access guide to all the information that sits below it in a way, or that's available on the net.
Yeah, prior to the arrival of open access, the way that you found out what to read was what your professors and friends were reading. It was not actually what librarians recommended. And there's a large literature showing this. It was word of mouth, basically. Trusted sources like university press catalogs. Then with the arrival of the internet, you find today, anytime you put anything into the internet, you get 1 million results. Half of them are the same content being rebranded, repackaged, remanaged, re-advertised. It's just so incredibly difficult to find anything useful on the internet today, because you need to be able to sift, filter, evaluate, and trust the different sources that you read. And that's so difficult for students. It's difficult for me, because I could tell you more about the process of trying to buy a new mattress. As a non-mattress expert, the people trying to advertise mattresses, I had to use all of my liberal arts education to figure out what was going on. There was such a huge amount of misinformation, So trying to provide some trusted sources, to take the cultural capital that experts like me have and make it available for everybody without advertising, without selling anything, that's the goal.
Do you think anthropology has a particular view, or because of its toolkit has a particular benefit in learning? I mean, you're talking about learning how to search for things on the internet, for instance, and beyond that, is there something particular to anthropology that's very helpful in this new area of opening up the internet?
I think that field work, which is shared with several disciplines but is anthropology's hallmark, I think that's a great way to learn how to sift and sort information. Because when you're in the field, you just feel like you're overwhelmed with experiences, sights, sounds, sensations, feelings. And you have to learn to take risks. You have to think inductively. You have to make connections. You have to be willing to tinker. You have to accept failure, welcome it, and move on in a healthy way. And those are all things that people actually do when they search for information. Many other disciplines, like lab-based disciplines, I think would say, try to find a problem in equilibrium, create a perturbing condition among several samples. That's not really how it works for most people in real life. So I think that anthropology is quite good. Yeah. If you get a chance to do field work, I think you're going to be better at buying a mattress. That's the promise I make my students.
That's a great sort of quintessential sentence for the interview. We've already had anthropology is like love, so now anthropology will help you buy the perfect mattress.
Yeah, well, I think any kind of academic study, you're gaining the capacity, the generalized capacity to do things, right? When you get a degree in anthropology, it's not just to do anthropology. You do anthropology to get to be a more competent person, right? I think it just so happens that anthropology's distinctive method is particularly useful in the liberal arts context, or the liberal arts setting.
Just to go back to the beginning of the interview, when you talked about what got you interested in anthropology in the first place, thinking about racism, thinking about class, poverty, those sorts of issues, what role do you think anthropology has to play in uncovering or just documenting these things, or in fact changing the systematic inequalities, for instance, that are the source of a lot of these issues?
Right. It's such a great question, and I think anthropology can do a lot. You know, traditionally when you say, let's learn about race in America, you're told, let's read Black Boy or Invisible Man, other classics of African American literature, even Uncle Tom's Cabin, to help give you a sense of what life is like for people who are African American, assuming that you're not African American when you read this, right? Or you're told read Amy Tan if you want to understand the Asian American experience. And that's great, it's wonderful. Literature has an incredible power to move emotion and build compassion and empathy and raise awareness. But really, if you want to understand what it's like to be in a place that's radically different from you, or what it's like to be in the place that you're from but to see it deeper and from different perspectives, that's what ethnography does, right? That is the goal of ethnography. And ethnographers shine lights in places that there just are not enough journalists to cast their lights on. We'll cover anything, we'll talk about anything. And we have such a depth of work already. You know, one of the first ethnographies of Hollywood and movie making was done in the 1950s, The Dream Factory by Hortense Powdermaker. So it's not just different places, but it's also different times. We have such depth of experience. I think that is one of the key things, right? Just getting people to see what life is like for people who are different from them. The second thing that I think is important is to understand that when you hear about something in the news, stuff has been happening in that place for a long time before it got on the news. There are local dynamics and pre-existing discussions in place. You know, Haiti had issues before the earthquake. Afghanistan had a history before the US invaded. What is that history? That's another key thing that anthropology can help us understand, because anthropologists like to see complexity. We like to see detail, particularism. People never like to hear the favorite anthropological refrain, which is, it's complicated, because that's not an answer. But anthropologists always want to say, wait a second, isn't life more complicated than good guys and bad guys? Wait a second, this guy that you're calling a warlord, what would his allies call him? Wait a second, that place that is a factory, what was that place 100 years ago? The huge Buddhist temples, Buddhist images that were just blown up, why are there Buddhist images in the middle of Central Asia? You know, I think anthropology immediately wants people to dive into the local. You don't have to learn everything about everything, but just move beyond the stereotypes that you get in the sound bites and understand the local dynamics on the ground. That's what my book is trying to do with mining in PNG. And understanding local dynamics and that they pre-exist your experience of these places, that's central. It's central in the study of oil spills, gold mining, military invasion, conservation products, fair trade, coffee, all of these things. All of these things, if we want to understand them the way that affluent first world people like me and many of your readers do, we need to understand the local context, and that is what anthropology specializes in.
Wow, that's fantastic. One last question that we put to most people, or all people really, is for someone who's new, because this course is really pitched at high school level, first year level, and a lot of people won't have a background in anthropology. For those kind of people, how would you define anthropology in your 2-minute grab? You know, how would you define the core essence of anthropology and perhaps its core mission?
Oh, anthropology is the modern science of human behavioral variation. That's the short version. I don't know if that makes sense to somebody who's just left high school, but anthropology is the study of culture and cultural processes. It's the study of cultural process. That's really what it is that we study. I thought you were going to ask me what books they should read, because the books they should read is Guests of the Sheik by Elizabeth Warnock Furnia, which is set in Iraq shortly before the revolution that would eventually lead to Saddam Hussein coming to power. And it's a wonderful memoir of a woman living in Purda while her husband does ethnographic field work in a rural area. And of course she ends up learning more from the wives of the sheik than the husband does from the sheik himself. So yeah.
Which is also a great fieldwork warning and or insight that often the people you think your chief informants and you're dealing with a lot might not actually be giving you the full picture of what's going on in a particular place.
Oh, inevitably the first person who you meet who says, "I will tell you what's up," that's the person you should probably pay attention to for a week, and then you'll figure out what's really going on. Yeah, the professional middlemen are not the people you're looking for. The advice that I got is find cynical insiders. Those are the people you really want to try to talk to, yeah.
Okay, on that note, maybe we'll finish up. Thank you very much, Alex, for having us and talking to us.
Yeah, absolutely.